Bonjour à tous, and merci beaucoup, Stéphane. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. I shall be talking about the topic on the first slide, class religion and women's rights protest movements in Great Britain, 1800 to 1918. I shall start from a historiographical approach, which will introduce some themes which over the past 60 years or so, historians have foregrounded in their discussion of what the radical movements or the protest movements in Britain might have been about or were about. And of course, in most cases, this reflected contemporary issues which these people found pressing at the time. For example, the centrality of class, which was like a dogma for the generation which came into positions of power and influence in academia after the Second World War. And the titles here on the screen, starting from E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, 1963, Laboring Men, Hobsbawm, 1964, up to the book Class Struggle in the Industrial Revolution in 1970 by John Foster, presented various variations on the Marxist theme, which was largely adopted by everybody. The modern politics was about class and the formation of classes and the materialist struggle about material interests. And of course, this reflected the contemporary concern, so especially in view of the rise of the left in most of the West, and especially in France, Italy, Germany, and Britain with the Labour Party, the concern with the organized power of the labor movement and the idea that we should identify the sources, the origin of this powerful dimension of modern politics, which seemed to be dominant in the industrial West. The picture here, the photograph, is one of the first photographs of a mass meeting to have survived. It is the last mass Chartist meeting on Kennington Common in April 1848. And it shows in itself, indicates some of the flaws with the Marxist analysis of this protest movement. Because as you will notice in the picture, this allegedly working class movement was very composite. You see lots of people wearing a top hat, which was inevitably the dress code for the middle classes. And you see these people freely mixing with the flat-capped working men, which indicates much less than the sort of class polarization which contemporary historians in the 1960s and 1970s assumed to be the case for the protest movements you're talking about. Over the next 20 years, between the 60s and the 80s, the idea that the Chartist movement and much of the early working class and labor and artisan movement, which much less about class and much more about traditional politics, or indeed modern politics, and the demand for democracy in particular, became the next step, the next focus of the historiography. In 1991, a group of then young scholars brought forward this argument in Currents of Radicalism, of which I was one of the editors, which, first of all, refashions the whole idea of the protest movement as currents, different tendencies or different traditions within a wider radical or under a radical umbrella, much of which was in a relationship of continuity with previous 18th and even 17th century protest movements, the common ground.
I don't know if you can hear me. I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we can't see the PowerPoint. Would you mind sharing your PowerPoint with us? Because it's quite difficult to follow.
Let us go back then, yes. Nothing is lost. You can easily go back. Also, I don't have a text, so I can reinvent the text. Yes, so I press on share. You want to sit here?
That's so fine, thank you. Let's see. Normally, I must have not pressed properly. Is that the one? Can you see now?
Yes, we do. Thank you. Yeah, we can see that.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So there was perhaps.
I'm very happy.
Oh, that's much better. Thank you very much.
Okay, then. So just to start from the beginning, the paper covers this period, and the focus is on protest movements, which I approached from the point of view of the historiography to begin with, which has developed, now I cannot, sorry, about the interruptions, which has developed through over the past 60 years in response to changes in contemporary political landscape, not only in Britain, but in most of the other European countries, primarily with the decline of the industrial working class organized in trade unions and represented in politics by socialist or labor parties, and the development of a less industrial focused tradition of political democracy, which finds its precursors in various movements in the 19th century. So starting from the making of the English working class in 1963, we can trace the gradual sort of transformation of our perception of what the protest movements were about. The Making of the English Working Class is actually a book which has aged much better than others because there are so many different insights in this book, one of which is certainly the power of the democratic tradition and the autonomy of politics. Thompson was an early English reader of Gramsci, but he interpreted Gramsci through the lens of his Methodist background. He was not a believer, Thompson, but his father was a Methodist minister, and he grew up in this strongly ethical and religious atmosphere, which enabled him to understand the power and the resilience of the tradition of radical religion, or the religion of radical non-conformity. Basically inspired by by this reading of Thompson, a new generation of scholars started to reinterpret some of the evidence, including this picture of the last Chartist meeting in 1848, which, far from showing a compact and polarized society along class lines, within which you can tell the middle class and the working class aside, shows them mixed up with a large number of people, of men wearing top hats, in this which is supposed to be, and was perceived at the time to be, the closest Britain went to the proletarian revolution that Karl Marx had been predicting at the time, in fact, in 1848. So in this tradition, Currents of Radicalism, which was published and edited by myself and Alistair Reid, and published a series of contributions by young scholars, by 10 young scholars, on the theme of what radicalism, what political radicalism was about, the left was about at the time, focusing on politics out of parliament, but also on the early Labour Party. This book emphasized the continuity between radicalism, the early Labour movement, the Liberal Party, and the progressive nature of some of the policies which the liberals appropriated, championed at the time, and the Labour movement appropriated, particularly free trade, which Karl Marx had perceived at the time as merely a distraction for the working class and a means whereby a false consciousness was erected, but which emerges from the evidence as a very powerful tool for reshaping social relations in Britain, primarily because it came with a series of demands, primarily about consumer rights. So it is actually a platform which women would have been responding to. They didn't have the vote, but certainly they had influence. Consumer rights and shifting the part of the burden of taxation away from indirect taxes, which were grossly regressive, towards A, the income tax, and B, property taxes more generally. So in this respect, of course, there was an important dimension, a radical dimension, which contemporary people were fully aware of. But there was also a certain understanding of the relationship between state and society, and also of the limitations to impose to state intervention in industrial relations, which was also very important. So the state under free trade was supposed to abstain from taking sides in labor disputes, and instead to provide a level playing field by laying out certain laws which would protect property, and including labor, which is defined as a property at a very early stage, in fact, by Adam Smith in 1776, if not before. So including labor, and allow then the various components and groups in society to bargain for the best terms they can secure. So basically, within this understanding of industrial relations, you see from the early 1820s, with the repeal of the Combination Acts, the gradual integration of the labor movement into a national understanding, an understanding of what Britishness was about. And it is interesting, the Workers' Union, one of the many trade unions short-lived of this period, they have a union flag in the corner of their banner to indicate not the opposition to the British project as a whole, but their identification with it. And you see Britannia on the one hand, on the left hand, and on the right, justice. Free trade, so, was a policy of consumers, which this graph you see clearly represented. If you look at the period here, I don't know if you can indicate here, no, I can't. Around 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws, there is a drastic, immediate, and radical increase in the demand for sugar. This is just one of the many items of mass consumption which became accessible and part of the working class diet from 1846 onwards. And as you can see, with the decrease of the income of the duties on sugar, there was a radical transformation of the habits of the eating habits of the British nation, which was a practical way to explain why Gladstone, the chief politician in charge of this series of fiscal reforms, became the working man's friend. And the like to be represented as such, the stick on which he's leaning here is actually an axe, and this is a photograph taken on his estate in 1876 by a group of visitors who had come to pay respect to him from Liverpool and Manchester by train. And it was a totally unannounced visit. He was chopping down trees, and some of the visitors took a photograph, which became sort of a symbol of him as a working man. But even before this photograph was taken in the 1870s, you have a gradual building up of labor support and trade union support for this understanding of the relationship with society and the state. The development of the amalgamated societies, a new form of trade union combining the function of a friendly society with that of a trade union, that is the functions of a mutual insurance company providing certain support, for example, death insurance for members and their families, with the traditional functions of a trade union as a bargaining organization for the trade unions, became the way in which protest movements among the working men, the working classes, developed especially from the 1850s onwards, culminating from 1871 and 1875 with the full integration of trade unions into the framework of the national institutions of Britain, when they received a status which protected their funds and their functions, including peaceful picketing, and abolish any special criminal legislation which had targeted trade unions and strikes as such until then. And from then on until more or less the crisis of the 1920s, you have the development of a strong relationship between the Liberal Party, which was associated with both free trade and this legislation, and indeed with religious dissent, and the trade unions. Figures like Mabon, William Abraham of the Welsh miners, and Thomas Burt, who served in Parliament as a representative of the Northumberland Miners' Union from 1874 until 1918, one of the longest-serving members of Parliament, and retired as Father of the House in 1918. They remained really the emblematic, the expressions of this transformation of labor protest from the sides to the mainstream of British politics, and also the foregrounding of religion as the primary form of expression of radical demands, primarily through the means of democratic or labor interpretations of passages such as the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus Christ, or certain books of the Bible, like the Book of Amos in the Old Testament. In the context of this transformation, and in parallel with it, the role of religion as a branch of the Constitution, and also as a site of conflicts in British society, became a main theme in British historiography. John Parry, his Democracy and Religion, came out in 1986. From the Peterhouse School, argued that, in fact, the Liberal Party fell apart when the three dimensions were represented on the cover by these cartoons, that is the Church of England, the Glastondian Broad Church, attempt to include all the various aspects of British Protestantism, and indeed Irish Catholicism, and the nonconformist tradition represented here by the figure on the right, the journalist Edward Mile, but they started to pull in different directions in the 1870s, and the Liberal Party became increasingly difficult to hold together. John Parry has always, throughout his career, adopted this pessimistic view of the ability of liberalism to survive the challenges of religious tensions and the politics of emotions. In 1991, Linda Colley produced a then revolutionary account of the making of British national identity, which focused on Protestantism and anti-Catholicism as the two areas in which a sense of Britishness emerged from 1707, the Act of Union between England and Scotland, and 1837, the accession of Victoria to the throne. Protestantism was an all-embracing political ideology as well as a powerful religious tradition, and brought together all social groups in society instead of a working class, in fact, in working classes or classes in general, with a consciousness similar to the one E.P. Thompson had described. You have populace, which is difficult to pin down in any more specific way, brought together by this combination between fear of Catholic domination, large for a long time represented by France, and the various teachings which Protestant churches shared with one another. Of course, this was a potentially and largely conflictual interpretation of what Britain and protest movements consisted of, not least because, of course, it shifted the focus away from debates about cost and benefit analysis, similar to the ones on which currents of radicalism or free trade politics was based, towards issues concerning less tangible issues and non-negotiable issues concerning religion. In Ireland, of course, this became much more disruptive because here you have two major confessions, Protestantism and Catholicism, facing one another. And this was the interpretation put forward by Paul Bew at the beginning of the 20th century, the politics of enmity. It's a projection of this emphasis on religion. Now, let us look more in detail about the whole idea. For one thing, although Britain is identified with liberalism, the constitution was and is, to a large extent, one in which religion and politics are part. Religion is part of the constitution, and the Protestant churches are deeply intermingled with the political tradition and the constitutional development of the country, especially until 1829, when Catholics were given full political rights. Parliament operated as the highest synod of the established churches of England and Scotland. Bishops to the present day sit in the House of Lords with full voting powers. The Reformation as such had been a parliamentary process in England, even more so than in the Scandinavian countries. So the early stages in adapting this system to the Industrial Revolution and to into modernity were mediated through the churches and the representatives in Parliament, and particular, according to Richard Brent and indeed John Parry, the development of a liberal,
Je vais demander à tous les participants d'éteindre les micros, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. So, the early stages in the 19th century, when the state tried to target its social problems and adapt itself to the challenges of this new society which was emerging from industrialization, were mediated through through the vision that members of the Anglican Church in particular and the Church of Scotland had of the social problems facing the political elite. The main problem was avoiding a revolution, or revolutions such as the ones which had transformed the continent of Europe from 1789 onwards. And this involved three distinct goals: decoupling religious fervor and partisanship from constitutional setup, which was very challenging and continued to be challenging until the 1920s at least, because the constitution was a religious one. Decoupling political rights from gender hierarchies, because these hierarchies had become increasingly incompatible with the demands of an industrial system. And finally, decoupling industrial bargaining from political protest, which is already what I've already discussed earlier on. This could be done by retaining the established church as a church of the constitution, but making it inclusive, less dogmatic, and basically latitudinarian. The alternative had been clearly set out from as early as the 17th century in the context of the Cromwellian Revolution, which would have been the complete separation between church and state, not between politics and religion, but between the institutional church and parliament, and the creation of a competitive system within which different religious groups would have similar claims and similar rights. From 1828, this model became increasingly the goal again towards which politics on the left started to move. And in fact, the single most important signifier of political allegiance and political tendency throughout the 19th century and well until the 1960s is the presence of a strong non-conformist constituency or representation in a certain part of the country. So wherever religious groups which are not part of the Church of England are strongly represented, and by this I mean the Baptists, the Methodists, the Independents, the Presbyterians, and other groups, wherever these groups were strongly represented, you have a strong tendency of the local electors to vote for non-conservative parties. Until 1918, the Liberal Party, later on increasingly the Labour Party. And the demographics made for a highly fluid situation because, as the census of 1851 indicated, by then 50% of the churchgoers were non-Anglicans. Now, the advantage of this system, and that is a unique dimension in Europe, or rare dimension in Europe, Belgium is the other example. The advantage is that it could be espoused and was adopted by the Catholic Church. Cardinal Cullen was born in the midst of the turbulent, but in fact the Civil War accompanying the 1798 rising in Ireland. Then he grew up in Rome, where he was first head of the Irish College, and then very close to the Pope. He had a great respect, but a great fear as well of liberalism and revolution politics. When he became Archbishop of Dublin, he decided that the best way to avoid such a development in Ireland was to espouse a degree of liberalism, particularly in terms of the relationship with the state and in terms of the relationship with other religious groups. This was a strategy already established 20 years earlier by Daniel O'Connell, when in 1829, by championing liberal politics, secured a political rights for Catholics. Catholic emancipation, as it is said, was effectively the ability or the right, entitlement for Catholics to take up a position of official positions in the magistracy or indeed in parliament without having to take the Protestant oath. In 1868, Cardinal Cullen took the extraordinary step of establishing a sort of informal alliance with John Bright, Quaker liberal member of parliament, the champion of this establishment, in proposing this establishment, the separation between church and state, as a way forward to manage the relationship between religious groups in Ireland and further afield. Now, for historians, the question is whether liberal government could cope with the politics or raw emotions which this establishment unleashed. John Parry, in his The Rise and Fall of Liberal Government in Victorian Britain, took a negative view, as usual, and basically sees the rise of emotional politics, the rise of revivalist politics as the beginning of the end for liberal government in Victorian Britain. And typically I took the opposite view in this book, which Stefan has already mentioned. And the most important difference is that Parry regards liberalism as something which is self-contained, is in an environment within which only the elite are represented in parliament, within which rational opinion, the opinion of the educated elite, are the ones consulted, in which decisions are taken in a almost clinical way by this gentleman meeting in parliament without having to cope with the challenges or pressures from without. Whereas I see it as I see liberalism as an expanding and flexible political tradition which could incorporate very easily different demands and was certainly up to cope with the politics of emotions in the from the 1870s onwards. In fact, one dimension of modernity was not the separation between religion and politics. The separation between religion, the church and the state is not the same as the separation between politics and religion, as the United States keep reminding us all the time. And that is what you have in England at an early stage, especially and at first primarily in the Protestant tradition. Politics became applied Christianity for as long as Christianity was what people wanted and felt strongly about. And this was all the more easier in Britain because the churches were controlled by lay people, like these elders being inducted by a minister of the Church of Scotland in a famous painting at the 19th century. But it was not gender exclusive, primarily because emotions were regarded as the area within which women were more responsive, sensitive, and alert than men. And there were issues which were enormously emotional and very political from the start. The anti-slave trade campaign from the 1780s, and later the anti-slavery campaign. So from the start and throughout the history, women featuring prominently, not only behind the scenes, which they always done, but also at meetings. And in fact, some of them are here prominently sitting behind the speaker or in the public at this anti-slavery convention in 1840. And within various denominations from as early as the 17th century with the Quakers, women had the right to speak up and to pray and preach during the meetings in a much less formal setting than the Church of England or the Catholic Church allowed. And when they spoke, they produced a set of ideas which did not reflect any established or academic theology, but rather responded in a much more immediate way to the emotional needs of the time, the issues at stake in a specific community, and simple but effective application of biblical teaching to contemporary social and moral issues. Temperance, education, and the reformation of society in general were some of the issues women were primarily active in this period. In fact, they continue to do so, and to a large extent to the present remain so, because temperance in particular affects one of the most devastating problems in English-speaking societies, the abuse of substances, particularly alcohol in the 19th century and to the present day, and now drugs as well. But there is a continuity in this area between the campaigns of the 19th century and those of the 20th century. So there is a shift as well in the historiography away from traditional class, or in my view also from the obsession of John Parry with the role of the established churches in parliament, in politics, towards issues such as citizenship, how to define it. Is it inclusive of women? Is it inclusive of people of different races? And how does it relate to ways in which you understand the world? And community. What is community about? Is it a local community? Is it a community of emotions? For example, in relation to some outrage which people go out in the streets and the squares to contest. Slavery could be one, but there are many others. Or is it a community based on the circulation of certain periodicals, as Lucy Delap indicated with the feminist press at the beginning of the 20th century in her first monograph? Some of the early campaigners for temperance and many other of the issues which I've already mentioned, like Josephine Butler, were both evangelical Anglicans. They were deeply concerned with the equality of women, including prostitutes and women of the working classes, as members of society and the community. And from the campaign to protect the rights of prostitutes to the campaign against the white slave trade and child prostitution, the step was short. And in fact, this was one of the areas in which women in politics continued to be very active in the 20th century. The last of the issues in which she was involved, but also the most significant in a way, was the campaign for the rights of women to the parliamentary vote. And that is an area in which you find the convergence between radical religion and evangelical religion and secular radicalism. In fact, John Stuart Mill, the author of the most emblematic and significant of the text on women's rights, The Subjection of Women, 1869, which he composed together with his wife and published 10 years after her death in 1869, was immediately translated in a remarkable large number of languages within months of its publication in English, including Russian, Chinese, Italian, French, and many other languages. And this was a radical text which to the present day retains its radical significance, in which basically it was denouncing the civic and the position of women under the law as a form of slavery, although of course reality moved on from what the letter of the law prescribed at the time. There were immediate repercussions. In 1869, women ratepayers were given the franchise for certain local authorities. In 1870, these included the school boards, which had wide-ranging powers to define the syllabus and also to define taxation for education purposes. For example, the London School Board was until 1889 the only board, the only representative council to represent Greater London, and it had women sitting on it. And the school board defined for the largest city in the British Empire everything the education of children was to be about, and also whether it was to be free or supported from school fees. It is supported from rates, general taxation, or school fees paid by the parents. Well, very soon, women entered national politics. Probably the turning point is the campaign for Home Rule for Ireland, which was followed in 1887 by the formation of the Women's Liberal Federation. Now, this organization is interesting because for the first time, women demanded a voice in the making of national politics outside the sphere of traditional female or feminine issues such as education or even the slave trade. This was about the Constitution of the United Kingdom and whether or not parliamentary devolution should be granted to Ireland. And for the people composing the Women's Liberal Federation, this was an issue about which they had a specific view to establish. They also had the claim that they were, because of the sensitiveness to emotions, there's something to say about international relations, something which Parliament had to take, to consider very seriously. The Conservatives were quick to follow. In fact, from as early as 1885, they established the Grand Ladies' Council of the Primrose League that is different from the Women's Liberal Federation because it was about politics as leisure. But through the formal leisure, they actually presented typical imperialist and conservative political issues in the form of plays and children's games and receptions on the grounds of the grand big houses of the aristocracy, during which performances and entertainments with imperial themes would be offered for the people attending. From 1908, this took a more formalized form in the shape of the Conservative and Unionist Women's Franchise Association, a member of whom was Millicent Fawcett, a lecturer at Newnham College, Cambridge, and the wife and widow of a great radical Henry Fawcett, former Postmaster General in the second Gladstone government. Millicent Fawcett became a strong opponent of Home Rule for Ireland. So you see how the emotional nature of this particular turn in liberal and national politics affected and mobilized women on both sides of the divide, for and against. The next generation of women to be active in politics continued the demand for a voice in Parliament, but there is a remarkable development here. Radical methods in campaigning go together with very moderate political aims. And in fact, when the vote was achieved, the first women to sit in Parliament were members of the aristocracy, Lady Astor for the Conservative Party, and Constance Gore Booth from a distinguished Anglo-Irish family of the west coast of Ireland, who had become Countess Markievicz, here represented in the uniform of the Irish Citizens' Army. She took part in the 1916 rising, and she remained a strong revolutionary and Republican member of the Dáil afterwards. Now, the remarkable thing is that although she was radical in politics, she was very conservative in social relations. She never allowed anybody to forget that she was Countess Markievicz, and she had to be addressed as Madame, and people should know their place when speaking to her. More or less, the same could be said of many of the other women who entered politics in 1918. So going back for a moment and for my conclusion, to the beginning of the lecture, it is remarkable that when the labor movement started to detach itself from liberalism, particularly we can take the conference of the Independent Labour Party in 1893, at which the party itself defined its objects in politics. At this point in time, the force which was most radical in British politics defined its goals as being represented in Parliament, being part of the representative system, perceiving the Parliament as the uncontested site of political negotiation, even for those who want to secure radical change. And this remained, in fact, the constant feature in labor politics for the next 120 years or so. Vincent Comerford, writing about violence, political violence in Ireland, argued in an article many years ago, the political violence was the means to secure access to the political process for groups which were until then marginalized. In Britain, you could say something similar. There is not so much violence, but radical agitation seems to have the aim to secure access to a parliamentary voice. And this means that the whole system retained from the beginning to the 1920s and the 20th century a high level of legitimacy, especially legitimacy for traditional institutions, including Parliament, even the House of Lords, and the monarchy, and indeed the churches. There was a basic conservatism of social instincts across the board for all the groups discussing this paper, ranging from radical artisans to women in politics, and indeed all the other religious groups which at different stages proposed amendments and changes in the way the country should be run. Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labour and the first working man to serve as Prime Minister in 1924. He ended his career in 1931 as the Prime Minister of a largely conservative party-dominated coalition government, which split the Labour Party and positioned MacDonald and the supporters of his breakaway faction at the very center right of the political landscape of interwar Britain. Well, I don't know what you make of it, but we can discuss it if you like. And on this note, I shall conclude my remarks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. Fascinating, absolutely thrilling. So lots of insights into different aspects of what a lot of the students have been working on. I think there'll be lots of questions. I've got several, but perhaps I'll turn to the floor, to the audience. Have you got any? So I suggested that people online might send their questions through the chat box.
You want to see?
And I think, well, I've got my phone, so I hope I don't miss any. And perhaps in the room there'll be questions as well among the students or colleagues about what you said. While people are trying to pull together the strings of what you said, I was thinking about what you were saying about the realm of politics. Really, isn't there some form of tension between different understandings of politics? On the one hand, politics as defined by institutions, parliamentary institutions, and people situating themselves regarding their representation in a parliamentary democracy. And then another understanding of politics that emerges through that movement that is really central to the syllabus, which is that of history from below, which considers politics not so much in terms of what agents are aiming at, but rather considers politics as a form of organization, of community, of belonging, and that would imply perhaps there would be questions underlying that about whether politics is about equality or about difference, asserting one's difference rather than considering that everyone is equal before, say, the law. I'm thinking of that because, for instance, concerning women, so that there was, of course, the suffragette movement aiming at obtaining the right to vote, but then at the same time there was also a form of activism that some historians have tried to retrieve or recapture, which was focused not on what they obtained or what they achieved, but mainly about how they organized, how they tried to define their sense of identity. So following the footsteps of E.P. Thompson, but how they tried to define their identity as different from men's. And there perhaps there were some differences between Fawcett's conception of women or feminist rights, let's say, and on the other hand, people like Octavia Hill or Florence Nightingale, who were perhaps more focused on the differences.
Thank you. That is a very interesting question. But starting from Florence Nightingale and Octavia Hill, both of them, yes, of course, they articulated clear understanding of femininity, but they were very focused on securing power and changes in the way political power responded to the issues they were concerned with. For example, in the aftermath of the Crimean War, Octavia Hill secured the creation of a commission, a royal commission, for the reform of the way medical services were run for the British Army. And she lobbied the Queen and the Prince Consort on this very issue, and she pulled all the strings. So, of course, she had been acting the role of the nurse and the practical organizer of medical services in the Crimea, because she was impelled, like many of these other women taking part in social reform, for example, the anti-slave trade or the campaign to end the Contagious Diseases Act. She had been involved in hands-on approach to certain issues, but she had from the start and increasingly a clear understanding that what she needed was political change as implemented and enforced by Parliament. And in order to do so, she had to force men to do things. This created, of course, according to some, a crisis of identity for herself, because she became the unwomanly woman, the woman wielding power and making men do things which otherwise they would not have done. And this may have explained why she withdrew to a private life in the latter part of her career. Octavia Hill was likewise, of course, very practically minded, but more than anybody else, she brought about a change of understanding in the way housing for the working class should be run and charity should be organized. So, if you like, they illustrate, both of them, how women before the franchise, of course, elite women, we are talking of elite women, could bring about political change which depended on what men decided in Parliament. There are many other examples. I don't think the politics of identity or the expression of identity has ever been an end in itself. This may gratify the academic mind because we like to engage with abstract ideas and so on and so forth, but people engaged or caught up in certain situations, they immediately perceive the significance of what they demand. So, for example, if you want trade union legislation, you do so because otherwise you will not be able to secure the bargaining or the outcome in industrial negotiation or industrial conflicts which you're trying to achieve. Of course, in the process, you bring together the other working class people or working men into an association, but that is never an end in itself. And the remarkable thing in Britain is that everything goes through this bottleneck of Parliament. Parliament has to take certain steps. Actually, I don't have time to go into it now, but there is new trends or new developments in the historiography of Ireland in particular. We show how Parliament was responsive, the English Parliament was responsive to petitioning from Irish women from certain section of the economy before the Act of Union, when this touched on issues which were perceived to be of national interest, such as the protection of printed cotton and linen in Ireland against the import of Indian printed calico in the 1780s. Women were very careful and very able in mobilizing and addressing Parliament in ways which would make Parliament difficult not to respond, even well before 1918, perhaps even more so than since then.
Thank you, Eugenio. Other questions? So there's time to think. There are several questions among the people online. So the first question is about someone wondering if you could explain again the difference between the separation of between church and state and religion and politics, the distinction.
Yes,
that's very interesting.
Thank you. Well, the church or the churches are institutions, And the Reformation in England started when Parliament supported Henry VIII's decision to separate the English Catholic Church from the Roman Catholic Church. This went through 10 different acts of Parliament within 15 years, as I said earlier on. And it was, in this sense, a parliamentary reformation. But the changes in religion, that is, in how people perceive Christianity related to spiritual matters and understood the text or the teaching that the church offered, was quite a more prolonged process, which involved, among other things, first of all, the immense popularity of the Bible when it was made widely available, especially in the authorized version, which became a classic of the English language, even more than Shakespeare, and remained so until the 20th century, when it was replaced, if you like, by modern translations. So once the Bible is available, and in fact it shapes the English language, and you must wonder, how is it possible for people in Newcastle and people in Sussex to understand one another before the television and the radio creates a common received in English that everybody understands? And this was the Bible. The Bible is the medium whereby the English language as a popular language is created. The same had happened in Germany, of course, and in other countries. But in the process of appropriating the Bible, they also appropriate this understanding of what the Bible should say or should mean, which then becomes popular religion. And popular religion has a life of its own, especially in the denominations which broke away from the Church of England, within which the ministry was not trained in Oxford and Cambridge, was trained out in academies or abroad, for example, in Geneva or in Scotland. These are primarily the Presbyterians, and then other denominations, the Independents. This was the tradition to which Oliver Cromwell and many of the revolutionaries in the 17th century belonged. They're like the Presbyterians, so the Église réformée in France, but without synods. And then the Baptists were the more radical, popular wing of the Reformation until the Methodists came about. In each of these cases, much of the ministry is done by non-academically trained ministers. They're trained in the pulpit, and their understanding of the Bible emerges from this sort of koine, theological koine dialectos, theological common language, which is what everybody has been understanding the Bible to be saying on the basis of a combination between popular demands and expectations of justice and what the actual text of the Bible says. So that is Christianity and religion. It's not the institutional church anymore. The tension arises from the 1820s when the institutional church, the claims of the institutional church to be by law established are challenged. And they're challenged primarily in the sphere of accessing representation in parliament, and then in the sphere of education, and then in the sphere of civil entitlements to various positions in society or to the protection of religious endowments and so on and so forth. Of course, once a religion and the church are two different things, they also acquire a different dynamic and relationship with power. A popular religiosity of the type I've described is the religion which brings people to casting their votes at elections. And they vote because they want certain things done. Some of them have religious reference or relevance. For example, separating education from the teaching of the Church of England. Others are different, but maybe inspired by similar religiously defined demands. For example, temperance, that is limiting access to the sale of alcoholic beverages because it's felt to be damaging to the working class family, or many other issues which I can discuss if you like. But this makes for a form of politics which is very religious, but not dominated by the churches. So very religious, but not clerical. The funny thing is that something similar happens with Irish Catholicism. I'm not going to talk about Ireland, but it is a way in which the English model is contaminates or affects religiosity in Ireland as well.
Thank you very much. If you've got questions, please let us know.
Also, with reference to questions you may feel or fear, you have to answer in your examinations. So be very instrumental and very manipulative. Yes, please. No. There is, from the 17th century onwards, a very large number of radical men and women, including some, there was a reference to a Quaker writing in the 1640s, claiming in the midst of the Puritan Revolution that women should have full equality with men in terms of the power of the pulpit. Think of the pulpit as a form of medium, because for centuries it was the way in which you could address legally masses of people, men and women, with authority. Now, when in the 1640s, Quaker women and men say women should be speaking from the pulpit, or in fact there should be no pulpit at all, but in the midst of the meeting anybody can stand up and teach the congregation as he or she is moved by the Holy Spirit. But this is an immensely radical demand. Later on in the 18th century, Daniel Defoe wrote extensively about women's rights. He was himself a nonconformist. He wrote especially in the shape of novels. Some of his novels are so radical that they should be revisited from the history of feminism. And of course, I should have mentioned John Bunyan, again in the 17th century. The second part of his, the Pilgrim's Progress is about Christiana, the wife of character of the first part of the book, making a voyage to the holy city on her own. And then, of course, at the end of the century, Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of The Rights on Women, the response to Thomas Paine, The Rights of Men, again coming from the far left of the, in that case, Unitarian movement, a movement which denied the Trinity and embodied many of the radical ideas that were written about. From the Unitarian movement came many writers in the 19th century, including John Stuart Mill's wife, whose name escapes me, Harriet Taylor, yes, who is, he credited her as being co-author of the rights of the subjection of women and indeed on liberty and many other writings. Of course, we shall never be able to establish to what extent he was right, was just writing with the, with a lover's passion about his late wife. But the fact remains that she was a very important presence in her life. And later on, I mean, it's remarkable how even women who were not feminists, like Mary Gladstone, was in fact very influential on her husband's understanding of politics and indeed of the way the Liberal Party evolved in the 19th century. So yes, there is a parallel history. I mean, women compose half of humankind, and you cannot have history from the start, really, without women. In fact, you cannot have any men without women. So yes, the answer is very much an emphatic yes.
And there's another question.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Voilà, opposite.
Can you switch off the mics, please? Thank you.
And send us a text, perhaps. Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Just redefine what you mean by politics and possibly linking between power movement and religion, which I do not quite get.
It's a great question. It's a very good question. And it has all sorts of historiographical and historical ramifications. The parliamentary reformation, which took shape from the 16th century onwards, was based on an Erastian understanding of the relationship between religion and politics, according to which the only way to avoid religion from becoming fanatical and driven by popular superstition or popular imagination was to restrain and to define the creeds of the creed through a parliamentary process. But throughout the 17th century and the 18th century in particular, with the various revivals, let us think of the Wesley revivals, the Methodist revivals, you have a return to a charismatic form of worship, within which the free expression of spirituality is given pride of place. In fact, it is the quintessential expression of the activity of the spirit in a meeting or in a person's soul, when this person can stand up and cry or sing or pray freely outside the defined liturgy, which the Book of Common Prayer or the Creed of the Church of England defines. Now, this is precisely what raw emotions at first was felt to be. Raw emotions as the ones which any ordinary man or woman, and here there is of course a strong both social and gender prejudice. Women were not expected to speak in public, and working class people in general, and men in particular, should know their place. But in a nonconformist, in a Methodist meeting, the opposite is true. It's the world upside down. The Holy Spirit speak to the humble, and the humble can stand up and teach the powerful and the great of the country, even the king or the queen herself, what the truth of Christianity may be about. From this level of spiritual expression or religious expression, raw emotions go into many other spheres. For example, temperance. The whole temperance movement is about imposing Puritan family values on society at large, whether men, especially men, like it or not. And this takes the shape of claiming the right or the power to legislate on the opening hours of pubs and places where alcoholic drinks are sold, from the magistrates, who are all members of the elite, to elected bodies within which ordinary ratepayers are represented. The power of the emotions is what John Parry regards as the destructive force in Parliament, when it starts to affect legislation also in education, taking away from the Church of England the control they had on Cambridge and Oxford and on education, generally speaking, and eventually foreign policy, the ultimate expression of these raw emotions, but in fact it is not the ultimate, is the 1876 Bulgarian agitation campaign. Was the first mass media reported agitation for what became human rights. The idea that human rights should be brought to bear on the way the foreign policy of the British Empire was defined. So not the idea that foreign policy is defined by people at the Foreign Office and in Parliament, gentlemen meeting in a quiet and meditative way, or whatever way they decide to do, but in a highly selective and socially exclusive setting. But it is in fact defined by ordinary people at mass meetings up and down the country. And these forms of raw emotions then affects other spheres of politics. Land reform is one. Trade union organizations is another one. demand for women's rights is a third one. And of course, modern historiography now has discovered the study of emotions as a field in itself. So it's a growing field. It's not limited to what I've just been talking about. But in the context of protest movements, this was really wrestling power again, not just identity, but power, the right to speak to power from people of the elite to ordinary men and women out there in the country, including journalists, by the way, because much of this politics of emotions goes through the press or through visual representations, photographs increasingly. Photographs are very emotional documents. When you see a photograph, I don't have it here, but of the 1884 mass demonstrations for the extension of the franchise, which is on the cover of my Liberty, Retrenchment and Reform. Well, when you see hundreds of thousands of people demanding something or other, this is very powerful. And you cannot simply say, oh, the decision on the vote should be limited to 600 men in the House of Commons. No, there are these hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and they require a response.
If I might just step in, Eugenio, about what you're saying concerning the positive dimension of emotions. Of course, it's true, it's currently being much spoken about. I'm thinking of a book published by Myriam Rebaud-Dallon, Passion Publique, which seeks to recapture emotions and rather than say they are dangerous and they are used by populists and therefore we should be rational and level-headed. So that's Passion Publique, trying to put emotions back at the center of politics in a positive way. And perhaps more in connection with what you were saying also, I'm thinking of books like the one by Nancy Rosenblum, Another Liberalism, where she tries to, so she links up liberalism not with the rational, calculating individual, cool-headed agent, but she links it up with Romanticism. And there was a whole liberal tradition that was let's say, driven by romantic representations.
This is all true, but from the start, both men and women were also responsive to very, try to find a word which is not a value judgment, but anyway, very non-progressive ideas, imperialism, and jingoism. Jingoism is the first study on mass emotions by Hobson in 1901. Jingoism. It's a study on collective emotions associated with the passions for the empire. I mentioned Millicent Fawcett. She was very emotional about unionism and stopping home rule. The revival of the Conservative Party already in the 19th century was all about manipulating nationalism, and particularly first anti-Irish feelings and then later imperialism. And to the present day, of course, we have Trump as the ultimate example. So it is a double sword to, what's the word? A sword which cuts both ways. Emotions can be, and they are manipulated for different reasons. And it is, historically, it is perhaps easier than in terms of political action to identify the limits and the context within which emotions can be deployed for the purpose of assessing or empowering liberalism rather than the opposite.
Other questions? There may be some in the audience, but there's another question in the chat box. Someone asking, how did the strategies and goals of 19th century British protest movements such as the Chartists or the Anti-Corn League interact with or challenge the liberal political ideology of the time? Were these movements seen as extensions of liberalism or as critiques of its limitations?
Thank you. Well, they were certainly perceived as critiques of its limitations, but liberalism was not, I think historically, John Parry would disagree perhaps, if we were here, was not a fixed or static set of political principles. In fact, the way in which it survives is by absorbing, incorporating, responding to these various critiques they receive. I'll give you an example which is not about Britain, but is very emblematic. Early revolutionary radicalism in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, had two goals. One was the Republic, the other one was radical land reform. Liberals and indeed even conservatives, or rather the Unionists, responded by incorporating radical land reform into what they were doing. So by the eve of the First World War, one important dimension of the radical critique of liberalism had collapsed. Irish farmers had become very conservative, and in fact they remained so ever since, even beyond imagination. And the same applies to most of the groups we've been talking about. Of course, in the case of the industrial working class, there has been other phenomena, such as in the industrialization and the transformation of the world capitalism, which has transformed altogether the nature of popular politics in Britain and many other countries. But essentially, the point is that although they start as critiques of liberalism, they gradually become absorbed, incorporated, transformed by it, and these institutions manage to find a way whereby they retain their identity, but they become inclusive rather than confrontational with these new demands. So the first women in parliament are conservative, and Labour movement becomes liberal, and in fact the Conservative Party relies to the present day on a large class support and so on.
I found very interesting the distinction you made between being radical in politics and conservative in social relations, about Constance Gore-Booth. Okay. There's one very last one in the chat box, and then we'll be able to have a lunch break. Don't you think that the criticism level that Marxist historiography should rather be directed at its Stalinist variety in the Communist Party historians group, which was mitigated and complexified by the rediscovery of the non-Stalinist Gramscian contribution?
Probably that is right. Although I made this very point many years ago, and I was a research fellow, and they told me, basically, Thompson was not a proper Marxist historian, and you have with Thompson already a radical departure from what should have been the Marxist interpretation of the Industrial Revolution. But again, like as for liberalism, this particular understanding that there is no orthodoxy except Stalinism creates a rigidity in our reading of political traditions, which I don't think is very helpful. So I agree with the person asking this question, but the fact remains that the focus of the Marxist or radical interpretation, radical Thompson or Gramscian interpretation of history in the working class has ceased to be an actor or an agent for radical change a long time ago. And has become, and the fact is revealing itself, especially in these Trumpian days, on a light which should force us to reconsider the nature and the origins of fascism in a way that goes well beyond the Marxist reading of fascism as proposed by Gramsci in the 1920s. So it's much more complex, more sinister, and difficult to read.
People like Georges Sorel, the conservative revolutionary.
Yes, Sam became very inspirational for Mussolini already then.
Okay, well, I think unless there are any more questions or responses, I think we can large round of applause for Eugenio.
Thank you.
That's the 100 or so people online who are also very grateful. Right, well, thank you very much, Eugenio. So for those who are available who have not got classes this afternoon or other commitments, there is the seminar this afternoon, Construction des Idéologies, again with Eugenio and with Karina Wending, our colleague from the University of Lorraine. about minorities, region in Ireland. And that's at 2 o'clock for those who are available. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.